Number 15. John Dillinger. One of America's most notorious gangsters of all time, John Dillinger led a gang that committed at least a dozen bank robberies in 4 states during the Great Depression. While many Americans grew to see him as a heroic Robin Hood-like figure, law enforcement considered him a major public enemy. Dillinger already had plenty of priors when he kicked off the year-long robbery spree with a $10,000 heist in June of 1933. By the following April, he knew that he was bound for one of 2 fates: prison or death. Authorities were determined to capture him. In fact, he was one of the main platforms for future FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's campaign to establish the federal law enforcement agency. While he seemed resigned to the fate of ending up either dead or behind bars, he also wanted to prolong his life on the lam for as long as possible. In the past, Dillinger had dyed his hair and used fake mustaches and other forms of disguises, but his picture was so widely distributed that he didn't think it would be enough to conceal his identity. So he paid $5,000 for plastic surgery to remove moles, adjust the angle of his mouth, tighten his cheeks, remove his dimples, and alter some of his other widely recognizable features. He also had his fingerprints burned off with hydrochloric acid. Another member of Dillinger's gang, Homer Van Meter, also received plastic surgery. The work was performed illegally by a former doctor named Wilhelm Loser, who famously provided plastic surgery to criminals during the 1930s. As an underworld figure himself, Loser had a history of dealing narcotics and had done prison time. There was nothing legitimate about the plastic surgery he performed, which took place in someone's apartment. Dillinger nearly died during one of his procedures when he choked on his tongue under general anesthesia. Not surprisingly, both men were extremely angry with the results of their surgeries, so much so that Van Meter threatened to kill Loser on the spot after seeing how the procedures turned out. Less than 2 weeks later, a brothel madam tipped the FBI off to Dillinger's location at the Biograph Theater in Chicago, where he was watching a gangster movie. Upon leaving the theater, Dillinger realized the property had been staked out by federal agents and attempted to flee on foot. But he was shot multiple times and died, bringing his criminal career to an end. Dillinger's body was put on public display before his burial, attracting more than 15,000 viewers. In 2019, surviving relatives sued for permission to exhume his body for a History Channel documentary amid rumors that the body might not actually belong to Dillinger. The court initially granted the request, but ultimately sided with the cemetery, which didn't want the exhumation to take place. The family then halted their efforts to have Dillinger's remains exhumed, and the History Channel show was called off. Number 14. Vladimiro Montesinos. For years, former Peruvian head of intelligence Vladimiro Montesinos received ample support despite indications of possible corruption. That all changed, though, in 2000, when videos of Montesinos bribing congressmen to support then-President Alberto Fujimori were leaked to the public. A scandal erupted and Montesinos fled the country with his tail between his legs. In the meantime, Fujimori was declared morally unfit for the presidency and left office. An investigation yielded evidence pointing toward Montesinos being involved in a plethora of crimes, including embezzlement, gun running, human rights abuses, and drug trafficking. While on the run, he sought asylum in Panama and was denied. He briefly returned to Peru, then traveled by yacht to the Galapagos Islands and Costa Rica. The boat's captain, Fidencio Anton Paiva, told authorities that Montesinos seemed defeated and desperate by that point, despite having an extensive network of connections and support. When he reached Costa Rica, the disgraced politician entered the country under a false identity and disguised himself by growing a beard. During the rest of his time on the run, he bounced all around South America and the Caribbean. Montesinos eventually ended up in Venezuela, where he gained entry under an alias and underwent plastic surgery in Caracas. However, he made one mistake. He failed to pay the bill. The clinic's director, Louise Ponte, told Reuters that he and his staff had no idea their patient was a wanted fugitive, let alone a high-profile one. Ponte said that Montesinos had his nose and eyelids reshaped. Venezuelan officials denied allowing anyone into the country under Montesinos' alleged alias, causing some people to accuse the country of helping him hide. Authorities adamantly denied the allegation and noted that while many Venezuelans were intrigued by the story of Montesinos' flight from justice, he wasn't the type of person anyone wanted in the country. With help from the US government, formerly one of Montesinos' biggest supporters, authorities apprehended the ex-official in 2001. He was deported to Peru, where he faced trial for multiple charges. In the end, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison and still faces several more trials for his alleged crimes. Number 13. Juan Carlos Ramirez Abedir. Nicknamed Chupeta or Lollipop, Juan Carlos Ramirez Abedir was the self-proclaimed leader of Colombia's biggest drug syndicate, the North Valley Cartel. He had an 18-year partnership with Joaquin Guzman, the prolific drug kingpin better known as El Chapo, that began during the 1990s after the two met in a hotel room in Mexico City. During that period, Ramirez supplied El Chapo with plane loads of his finest product. While testifying at El Chapo's trial in 2018, he said he amassed a $1.8 billion fortune. Over a 20-year period, he helped smuggle an estimated 400,000 kilos of cocaine into the United States and ordered hits on as many as 150 people. U.S. law enforcement began searching for Ramirez in 2004 after indicting him on federal racketeering charges. By then, he was also wanted on drug trafficking charges in America dating back to 1994. Colombian authorities denied an extradition request and a $5 million bounty was offered for his arrest. 2 years later, in 2006, the American government began seizing Ramirez's assets, but their efforts to track down the drug lord himself proved futile. Ramirez was finally captured during a drug raid in Brazil in 2007. While awaiting extradition to the US, he began cooperating with authorities who noticed that he looked a lot different from his mugshots. He admitted that he had undergone extensive plastic surgery in a bid to evade law enforcement and was recovering from his latest operation when he was arrested. When Ramirez took the stand during El Chapo's trial in 2018, he went into detail about the evolution of his face, stating that he went under the knife 3 or 4 times. He altered his jawbone, cheekbone, eyes, mouth, ears, and nose. The changes came following a years-long effort to erase his name, image, and fingerprints from public records. In addition to getting plastic surgery, Ramirez wore an array of disguises that included wigs and glasses. He hardly ever left his mansion for any reason other than to get plastic surgery, but when he did go somewhere, he was in costume. Sadly for Ramirez, he looked a lot better before all the work he had done to his face. The procedures left him with oversized cheekbones, an extremely wide jawline, a noticeably narrow nose, and other unnatural features. In 2010, he took a plea deal and agreed to become a government witness in exchange for a 25-year sentence. The information he's provided has helped lead to the capture and conviction of several high-profile drug traffickers, including his former partner El Chapo. Federal authorities also credit Ramirez with providing valuable intelligence on corrupt government officials, Colombian paramilitary groups, and cartel members who've murdered government informants and witnesses. Number 12. Andrew Moran. In 2005, Andrew Moran and several co-conspirators committed a violent armed robbery in Lancashire, England. When the case went to trial 4 years later, Moran leapt over the dock and fought off 4 guards before fleeing on foot. He remained at large for the next 4 years as he moved through Europe using various false identities and disguises. Moran grew his hair out, sported a mustache, had a mole removed from his chin, and even underwent plastic surgery in a bid to make himself difficult to recognize. Spanish and British authorities tracked him to a villa in Alicante, Spain in 2012 and came up with a strategic plan to take him into custody. Police set up a roadblock in anticipation of the arrest, but Moran managed to bypass it and continued by leading law enforcement on a high-speed chase at speeds of up to 130 miles per hour. Authorities attempted another arrest 6 months later, in 2013. This time they caught him completely off guard as he sunbathed outside his villa with some friends. Moran attempted to flee by climbing over a wall, but he didn't get away. During a search of the property, police found guns, knives, drugs, fake passports, and documents containing at least 5 different identities and a large amount of cash. Photos in Moran's cell phone revealed that he lived a life of leisure and luxury while on the run. And he routinely received money from his girlfriend to help support his unreasonable tastes, which included a penchant for expensive cars and upscale vacations. During Moran's trial in Britain in 2016, the same judge who was presiding over the hearing he fled from 7 years earlier imposed an indeterminate prison sentence. Judge Norman Wright classified the sentence as necessary for public safety and noted the risks associated with freeing Moran, including ample access to resources which could enable him to stay on the run for long periods of time. While handing down the sentence, Wright said that Moran may never be released from prison, but he'll be eligible for his first parole hearing in 2014. Number 11. Caitlin Armstrong. During a trip to Austin, Texas for a professional cycling race in 2022, 25-year-old Mariah Wilson made time to meet up with her ex-boyfriend, cyclist Colin Strickland. Just minutes after returning to the house where she was staying, she was gunned down in cold blood. It didn't take long for investigators to discover that Strickland's girlfriend at the time, 34-year-old yoga instructor Caitlin Armstrong, was allegedly insanely jealous of Wilson. Surveillance footage from outside the house where Wilson was staying showed an SUV resembling Armstrong's pulling up to the address right after Wilson returned. The more detectives uncovered, the more they began to suspect Armstrong of murdering the victim in a fit of rage. Strickland cooperated with law enforcement and was eventually ruled out as a suspect, further narrowing detectives' sights on Armstrong. Her family issued a statement insisting she wasn't capable of committing such a horrific crime, but the fact that she went on the run did little to support her claim of innocence. After obtaining a warrant for Armstrong's arrest, investigators discovered that she'd sold her Jeep and flown to New York 3 days after the murder. Her trail went cold from there, sparking an international manhunt. U.S. Marshals tracked her down at a hostel in Costa Rica 43 days later. She fell under the suspicion of local authorities when she gave them her ID at a checkpoint, and they had no record of someone entering the country under her name. It was later discovered that Armstrong had flown to Costa Rica from Newark, New Jersey, with her sister's passport. The fleeing fugitive looked much different when she was picked up by law enforcement. She'd cut her normally reddish hair short and dyed it a dark shade of brown. A witness told Inside Edition that Armstrong left behind a receipt under the name Allison Page for a $6,350 plastic surgery procedure. During her time on the run, she had a bandage on her nose and bruising beneath her eyes, which she allegedly blamed on a surfing accident. However, a before and after comparison of her face shows dramatic differences in her appearance, including a slimmer nose and a narrower chin. Armstrong pleaded not guilty to murder and is slated to go to trial on October 30th, 2023. Number 10. Richard Ramos. Dr. Jose Castillo was a highly respected plastic surgeon based in Philadelphia who was praised among locals and members of the Hispanic community for generously providing free basic medical care to those who couldn't afford it. People were understandably shocked when Castillo was arrested in 1996 for knowingly performing cosmetic surgery on fugitive drug dealer Richard Ramos, who was wanted for selling more than $20 million worth of crack and cocaine on the streets of Philly. The drug ring that Ramos led was busted in 1990, but he managed to slip away to the Poconos, where he remained in hiding for nearly 2 years. He occasionally snuck back into Philadelphia for late-night plastic surgery appointments with Dr. Castillo, though, who reshaped Ramos's nose, sucked massive amounts of fat from his face and body, and smoothed over the man's bullet wound scars on his right cheek, so they were practically unnoticeable. The most shocking procedure involved cutting off Ramos's fingerprints and reattaching them upside down. Authorities finally captured Ramos in early 1992 while he was in the street changing his wife's flat tire. He was practically unrecognizable from the man people knew him as before all the plastic surgery, but admitted to his identity during questioning and was arrested. In the meantime, Dr. Castillo was federally charged with harboring a fugitive and obstructing justice. The respected surgeon claimed that he only treated Ramos once for grease burns, but that was quickly disproven. He then argued that he performed the procedures before Ramos was a wanted fugitive, which was also proven to be a lie. The community nevertheless rallied around him in support of his innocence and freedom. Ramos, who was originally facing life in prison, took a plea deal and agreed to testify against Castillo in exchange for a reduced 30-year sentence. A jury found Castillo guilty, and the judge sentenced him to a year of house arrest followed by 2 years of probation, along with 400 hours of community service and a $35,000 fine. Number 9. Ronnie Biggs. One of British history's most notorious fugitives, Ronnie Biggs, began his life of crime in 1963 when he and 14 others held up a mail train. He was 34 years old at the time and wanted money for a down payment on a house. Police tracked Biggs down and arrested him in London 3 weeks later after an accomplice failed to destroy evidence containing his fingerprints. And as a result, 9 of the conspirators, including Biggs, received 30-year prison sentences. In 1965, 15 months into his sentence, Biggs escaped from prison and fled to Brussels. From there, he met up with his wife, Charmaine, and his 2 children in Paris, where he obtained fake identity papers and underwent extensive plastic surgery to alter his appearance. The family then moved to Australia in 1966, and by that point, the money from the train robbery was almost gone. A large portion of it went to cosmetic procedures, costing the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Biggs bounced around Australia over the next few years, moving from one place to the next whenever someone warned him that authorities were on his trail. In 1969, he left the country on a cruise ship using a fake passport and spent a brief time in Panama before traveling to Brazil. Charmaine stayed in Australia with the kids and divorced Biggs in 1974 after discovering that he'd fathered a child with another woman. Authorities allowed her to stay in the country, and she made money to get on her feet by selling her story to the press. She went on to become a respected editor and journalist. Meanwhile, Biggs enjoyed a leisurely life in Rio de Janeiro, where he was safe from deportation due to the lack of an extradition agreement between Britain and Brazil. As a wanted criminal, he wasn't allowed to work, but he no longer had to hide his identity. So he supported himself by hosting parties and telling tourists about his life as a criminal on the run. By the time Britain and Brazil finally established an extradition treaty in 1997, Biggs had been granted lifelong residency in Brazil. He returned to the UK of his own volition in 2001 and was immediately imprisoned to serve out the remaining 28 years of his sentence for the train robbery. His health was deteriorating rapidly, and he petitioned for compassionate release multiple times before finally being freed in 2009. But Biggs died in 2013, just hours before a BBC special about the train robbery premiered. Number 8. Luis Carlos de Rocha. For nearly 30 years, notorious cocaine kingpin Luis Carlos de Rocha lived in the shadows while amassing a $100 million fortune from the illicit drug trade. Nicknamed the White Head, he operated cocaine production facilities in the wilderness of Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. From there, the drugs were flown to remote farms in western Brazil and Paraguay, where they were packed and hidden into trucks for domestic distribution and prepared for international shipments. De Rocha's operation distributed an estimated 5 tons of cocaine throughout Brazil alone each month, and his product was shipped as far away as Europe and the United States. To evade authorities, de Rocha went by false identities and altered his appearance through plastic surgery. He managed to go undetected for 3 decades, but he apparently didn't make dramatic enough changes to his face to hide forever. Law enforcement eventually managed to track him down by matching known photos of him to pictures that were taken under his assumed identity, Vitor Luis de Moraes. In addition to changing his appearance, de Rocha was protected by heavily armed guards. He has a reputation for resorting to extreme violence, so apprehending him would require a lot more planning and manpower than than simply taking a SWAT team to his door and kicking it in. Rocha was arrested in 2017 as part of a police mission codenamed Operation Spectrum, which aimed to prevent drug trafficking. Around 150 agents stormed 24 of his properties, where they seized an estimated $10 million worth of assets, including luxury cars, homes, and aircraft. They also found guns, suitcases filled with cash, and false identification documents. The kingpin himself was captured in the city of Sorriso, and in the end he was sentenced to more than 50 years in prison. Number 7. Tatsuya Ichihashi. 22-year-old British national Lindsay Hawker was smothered to death in 2007 during a year-long stay in Japan, where she took a job teaching English. Investigators traced her last known whereabouts to the apartment of one of her students, 28-year-old Tatsuya Ichihashi. 9 officers gathered outside the apartment in Chiba Prefecture, but Ichihashi managed to slip out of their grasp not once but twice after fleeing on foot. They found Hawker's brutally beaten and strangled body in a bathtub on the suspect's balcony. She'd been covered in compost and a substance used for speeding up decomposition. Ichihashi remained on the run for 2.5 years, despite thousands of reported sightings. Finally, in November 2009, he was apprehended in Osaka while trying to board a ferry to Okinawa. He initially denied any involvement in Hawker's murder, then tried to claim that he accidentally killed her while trying to stifle her screams. He also apparently told officers that he tried to resuscitate her. While in jail awaiting trial, Ichihashi wrote a book called Until the Arrest. In it, he wrote that he performed plastic surgery on himself in an effort to change his appearance. He didn't go into detail about Hawker's murder and instead focused on his time on the run. The fugitive's first operation on himself was a DIY nose job. Using a needle and thread, he bound his nose to make it narrower. After that, he tried to cut off part of his lower lip, which he completed on a second try after stopping the first time due to the excruciating pain. Next, he cut 2 moles off his face after noticing how prominent they were in a wanted poster featuring his photo. He further obscured his appearance by wearing a surgical mask, which wasn't an uncommon practice in Japan even during the pre-COVID era. He avoided eye contact and surveillance cameras as much as possible, moved frequently, and had 0 contact with his family and friends. Ichihashi also ended up using his savings to get a professional nose job. Afterward, the clinic alerted police and provided them with photos. The wanted murderer knew that he couldn't stay on the run forever though, and when he was finally caught, he surrendered without resistance. Hawker's family campaigned for the death penalty, but Ichihashi was sentenced to life in prison after a court concluded that there's a hope of rehabilitating him. Number 6. Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Mexican drug lord Amado Carrillo Fuentes worked with multiple crime syndicate bosses including Pablo Escobar and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. He eventually assassinated his boss and seized control of the Juarez cartel. Carrillo famously transported his drugs via a large fleet of chartered jets that were financed with laundered money, earning him the nickname El Señor de los Cielos, or Lord of the Skies. Throughout his lifetime, he amassed a $25 billion fortune, which would be worth around $40 billion in today's currency. Despite his immense power in the drug world, Carrillo didn't become a household name like other cartel leaders. To a large degree, he was a man of mystery who led a quiet and private life. Washington Post writer John Ward Anderson described him as a new breed, classified by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as a low-profile kingpin who behaved like a businessman. But Carrillo's lack of a public presence didn't make him immune to legal scrutiny. During the 1990s, U.S. and Mexican authorities turned up the heat on their search for Carrillo amid civilian protests in the state of Morelos, where residents accused the governor of turning a blind eye to drug activity. There weren't many photos of Carrillo circulating, owing to his discreet lifestyle, but law enforcement was nevertheless hot on his trail. After narrowly avoiding capture in 1997, he decided to make some extreme changes to his appearance. Going by the alias Antonio Flores Montes, he checked into a plastic surgery clinic in Mexico City, where he underwent a major facial reconstruction surgery and liposuction. The procedures seemed to go fine, but something went terribly wrong while Carrillo was recovering. Not long after, The man passed away at just 40 years old. Rumors that his death was faked immediately began to spread like wildfire. American officials announced that he suffered a fatal heart attack and released a photo of his body to dispel the claims, but even Carrillo's cousin said that the person in the casket was a look-alike and that Carrillo was fine. Authorities stood by their stance that the drug kingpin was dead and maintained their belief that Carrillo hadn't slipped through their hands. But several months later, the bodies of the two surgeons who performed Carrillo's surgery were found encased in concrete, and they showed signs of torture. Number 5. Hugo Armando Carvajal. Also known as El Polo or the Chicken, Hugo Armando Carvajal served as the head of Venezuela's military intelligence from 2004 to 2011. He also served as the country's top official against organized crime and the financing of terrorism, and in 2013, he became the head of military counterintelligence. By then, US officials had filed drug trafficking charges against Carvajal. They suspected him of supporting the trafficking activities of the Colombian guerrilla group FARC, which he denies. But regardless, they were eager to get him into custody as soon as possible. However, he remained a free man until 2019, when he was apprehended in Spain. Spanish authorities initially denied a request for extradition to the US, and Carvajal was released from custody. The decision was challenged and overturned, but by then he'd gone on the run and was nowhere to be found. In 2020, the American government filed narco-terrorism charges against Carvajal and several other Venezuelan officials, including President Nicolás Maduro, for their alleged involvement in the international drug trade. Carvajal was recaptured in Madrid in 2021 after evading law enforcement for 2 years. Shortly after his arrest, officials revealed that he'd avoided getting caught by using disguises and getting plastic surgery. In a statement, Spain's national police said that there was evidence of Carvajal undergoing several cosmetic procedures. They also found wigs, fake mustaches and beards, along with other accessories that were used to alter his appearance. He moved every 3 months and never left his house. His outdoor activity was limited to stepping out on his balcony at night, always in disguise. His extradition was approved, but Carvajal stopped it from happening by appealing to the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled to suspend the extradition. He continues to maintain his innocence, despite being accused of fighting his extradition as a stalling tactic. Number 4. Sarahat Sawang Xiang. Dealing drugs in Thailand is a risky business. The punishments are incredibly harsh and can include the death penalty, so it's not entirely surprising that 25-year-old kingpin Sarahat Sawang Xiang was barely recognizable when authorities stormed his apartment in early 2023. The young criminal had been arrested multiple times before, and he became wanted again in late 2022 after police intercepted a package containing a large quantity of MDMA that was heading to his address in Bangkok's Bang Na district. When law enforcement caught up with Sarahat 3 months later, they had to do a double take to make sure it was really him. His previously blemished skin had cleared up, taking years off his appearance. And after coming face to face with the drug dealer, officers finally understood why witnesses described him as an attractive South Korean man, which sounded nothing like the suspect they dealt with in the past. To achieve his youthful new look, Sarahat underwent a cosmetic procedure known as a face-off. He allegedly confessed to dealing drugs that he ordered on the dark web and paid for with cryptocurrency, and said that he planned to start a new life in South Korea under the name Jimin Seong, despite not knowing the language. That won't be happening anytime soon, however, because he's now in custody and facing a charge for importing narcotics. Number 3. Lennon Oliveira de Camo. After being arrested in 2018, Brazilian drug dealer and gang leader Lennon Oliveira de Camo, nicknamed Beleno, was granted release under the condition that he'd wear an ankle bracelet. He returned home to the state of Amazonas to serve his house arrest, but removed the monitoring device and went on the run. By then, Beleno had a long list of priors under his belt. Just a few years earlier, he participated in a violent prison gang riot. On the outside, he commanded an armed militia and ran a leisure club and meeting spot for drug dealers, which he created by diverting the flow of an entire river to create a bathing area. He eventually established a reputation for decapitating his rivals. After Boleno's escape from supervision in 2018, authorities warned the public that he was armed and dangerous and to be on the lookout for him, but they couldn't seem to find him anywhere. Police finally caught up with the fugitive 2 years later in 2020 when they found him living under the alias Elon Soares Cardosa in the city of Caucaya. He looked nothing like the man they were looking for, and his appearance came as a shock to authorities. Boleno doesn't even resemble the same person in his mugshots from before he fled from the law and the one that was taken after his capture. In addition to clearly losing weight during his 2-year absence, officials said he underwent at least 5 plastic surgeries to make himself look different. Boleno was killed in a shootout with military police in 2022 during a response to an anonymous complaint about armed men on a soccer field. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital and attempted to save him, but he succumbed to his injuries. Number 2. Tyler Adams. The man the FBI came to know and describe as a master of disguise, Tyler Adams was given the name Kevin Schoolcraft at birth. Over his lifetime, he's legally changed his name multiple times and has used over a dozen aliases. He also has an alleged plastic surgery obsession, which would explain his highly unnatural appearance in photos that were released to the public in 2022 after his girlfriend was found murdered in Mexico. Adams' first major criminal case came in 2009 when he was accused of fraudulently buying more than $3 million worth of real estate in California, taking out loans and credit cards in his parents' names. He pleaded guilty to 40 felonies and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. And in 2016, he was transferred to Hawaii to serve time for a previous fraud conviction. He escaped custody in 2019 and fled to San Diego, where he met and began dating 40-year-old Navy veteran Raquel Sabin, who knew Adams as Paul Phillips. The couple had a daughter in 2021, and 6 months later, they traveled to Mexico in Raquel's mother's vehicle. About a month after that, Raquel's heavily decomposed remains were found in the car. Her neck was broken, and her death was ruled a homicide. The baby was found safe elsewhere, and Adams was taken into custody for questioning in connection with Raquel's murder. He was uncooperative, though, and Mexican authorities turned him over to border agents at the San Isidro crossing after discovering that he was wanted for escaping custody in Hawaii. Somehow he managed to cross the border under the name Aaron Bain. Adams has been on the run ever since and remains wanted for a growing list of reasons, including law enforcement's desire to question him in connection with Raquel's murder. When authorities released photos of him to the public in hopes of receiving leads regarding his whereabouts, people were genuinely freaked out by his appearance. Images of Adams' transformation over the years show a disturbing shift from a natural-looking face to appearing more like a wax figurine. It's more than a little obvious that he overdid it with plastic surgery, and his vast array of hair colors and style shows that he truly does have the ability to make himself look like an entirely different person. Adams' stepfather, Donald Chaffee, told CBS 8 that the fugitive first had plastic surgery as a teenager. While in custody in San Diego in 2012, Adams filed a written complaint claiming that 2 fellow inmates beat him up and dislodged his cheek and chin implants. He then requested immediate medical attention. When asked how he felt about Raquel's murder, Chaffee said his stepson has always been a sociopath, but he never imagined Adams' behavior escalating to such gruesome violence. Hawaiian officials described Adams as a con man and a sociopath with no regard for his victims. Thinking about it in those terms, it's pretty scary to realize that he's still at large. Number 1. John Ruffo. In 1998, former business executive John Ruffo was convicted of swindling U.S. and foreign banks out of more than $350 million, making him one of the biggest banking fraudsters in American history. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison, but failed to turn himself into federal custody to begin serving his time. Ruffo was last seen withdrawing money from an ATM in Queens, New York, on the afternoon of his planned surrender. He hasn't been seen or heard from ever since, leaving authorities and even his own family clueless to his whereabouts. Shortly after his disappearance, his rented Ford Taurus was found abandoned in the parking lot at JFK International Airport. Multiple alleged sightings of Ruffo have been reported over the years, but the only credible lead came in 2001 when he tried wiring himself $250 million from Nigeria at several banks in Duncan, Oklahoma. But by the time the feds closed in on the area, he was gone. In 2022, former fraudster Seth Ferranti, who also spent time on America's Most Wanted Fugitives list, told the UK Sun that Ruffo might be living a totally normal, inconspicuous lifestyle under an assumed identity. He further speculated that the wanted white-collar criminal may have had plastic surgery to disguise his appearance or even to remove his fingerprints. After all, it would be reasonable to assume that he made some dramatic changes to his looks, or that he likely would have been caught by now. Ruffo is considered extremely intelligent and may be one of the few fleeing felons who actually is smarter than most of the people who are looking for him. He was a man with a plan, and he had international connections and access to resources that would undoubtedly enable someone to remain on the run for a long time. More than 24 years after Ruffo vanished, authorities still hope to catch the 68-year-old. In 2022, he was featured in the Hulu documentary Have You Seen This Man?, in hopes that the show would help lead to his capture. But for now, and possibly forever, he remains at large. If you were trying to avoid being recognized in your country, would you rather stay in that country and live in disguise, or live openly as yourself in another country that has promised not to deport you? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!